I think the one I enjoyed reading more than anything else was Harry Potter.
Beneath the gilded ceilings of Britain's most guarded palaces, treasures have passed from one generation to the next, symbols of power, history, and unbroken tradition. But when whispers surfaced that priceless royal jewels were vanishing, suspicion pointed to a shocking figure at the eye of the storm: Queen Camilla. What started as quiet murmurs quickly spiraled into one of the most explosive scandals the monarchy had faced in decades. And when irrefutable evidence landed on Prince William's desk, he was forced to make a choice that could shake the crown itself. This is the story of betrayal, exposure, and a title stripped, the rumour that refused to die. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a faint draft slipping under a closed door. In the early months of spring, a few palace staff exchanged knowing glances during a routine inventory of the royal collection. They said nothing in public, but behind polite smiles was the same unspoken thought: something was missing. At first, it was easy to accept the senior curator's explanations. Certain items had been sent on long-term loans to museums or moved for restoration. The royal vaults contained thousands of priceless pieces, each with its own story and purpose. A diamond tiara could vanish for weeks without anyone raising suspicion. But as weeks turned into months, more than one storied piece could not be accounted for. Whispers began curling through the corridors of grand salons, where portraits of past monarchs kept their eternal vigil. Staff lowered their voices when certain names were mentioned: a sapphire brooch worn by Queen Victoria at her coronation anniversary, a pearl choker famously gifted to Princess Diana by a Middle Eastern ruler, all missing. Even the ornate, diamond-encrusted snuff box, a relic from the Georgian era, had vanished. Each item had been logged in the previous year's records, yet now their locations were reduced to vague notations. No one dared suggest outright theft within the royal household, but unease grew. The palace, for all its grandeur, thrived on a fragile balance of trust and tradition passed down for generations. The jewels had always been kept under the tightest security, guarded not only by alarms and steel vaults, but by an unbreakable code of loyalty. To even imagine that someone from within might be responsible was unthinkable, and yet the evidence, or rather the absence of it, was becoming harder to ignore. A chance remark at a private charity event deepened the sense of unease. A well-connected art dealer from Geneva casually mentioned over champagne that a remarkably rare royal-style tiara had been purchased in a discreet Monaco auction. The design was almost identical to one believed to still be in the Queen Mother's personal collection. The dealer laughed it off as a convincing imitation, but the comment lingered in the minds of those who overheard it, gnawing at their certainty. Inside Kensington Palace, Prince William's aides began quietly cross-checking records, comparing old photographs to the current holdings. The deeper they looked, the more irregularities emerged. Pieces that should have been worn at state banquets had not appeared publicly for years, and official explanations grew increasingly thin. Still, the rumours refused to solidify into proof. No one wanted to bring such an accusation to the future king without certainty. Yet the story refused to fade. It lingered in the air, whispered down servant corridors, murmured in corners of formal receptions. An ever-present question hovered, and no one dared answer it aloud. In that tense and watchful atmosphere, the first discreet moves were made to find the truth. And though no one could have known it, the trail would lead far closer to the heart of the royal family than anyone dared imagine. The discreet investigator, aware of the unease that had taken root, knew the palace walls were no longer safe from suspicion. By the time the third missing piece was quietly noted in the official records, Prince William understood the matter had to be handled with precision. A public scandal was the last thing the monarchy needed, but the loss of irreplaceable heirlooms could not be ignored. It was no longer enough to rely on explanations provided by the keepers of the royal collection. If there was truth to the whispers, someone outside the usual channels would have to uncover it. William's choice was deliberate. He turned to Simon Harcourt, a former intelligence officer who had transitioned into private security consulting. Harcourt had handled sensitive assignments for the royals before, quietly, efficiently, without a trace in the press. He understood the weight of discretion, and more importantly, the stakes when loyalty wavered. Their meeting took place in one of Kensington Palace's lesser-known drawing rooms. rarely used for public events. Heavy curtains muted the daylight as William outlined the problem in measured tones. He spoke not as a future king, but as a man determined to protect his family's legacy. Harcourt listened without interruption, eyes narrowing at mentions of private auctions and Geneva dealers. When William slid a small, leather-bound notebook across the table containing a detailed list of the missing pieces and their histories, Harcourt accepted it with a solemn nod. The first step was to cross-reference palace records with those of reputable public and private auction houses. Harcourt worked from an unmarked London office, sifting through archives, sale records, and photographs spanning decades. He knew that if genuine royal pieces had surfaced for sale, they would be disguised under vague descriptions or routed through intermediaries. That trail, however faint, could still be followed by someone who knew what to look for. Weeks passed with little to report. The work was painstaking, hinging on tiny details like gemstone cuts or the engraving on a clasp. Then, one late evening, Harcourt found a match. A diamond necklace listed in a discreet Parisian auction bore an uncanny resemblance to one worn by Queen Elizabeth II during a state visit in the early 70s. The seller's name was hidden behind a corporate front, but the transaction had been facilitated by a luxury broker with ties to several European royal houses. It wasn't yet enough to draw conclusions, but the puzzle pieces were starting to align. Harcourt prepared his findings for William, careful to note the gaps that still remained. What struck them both was the pattern. The jewels weren't disappearing at random. They were being moved with intention. Whoever was behind it understood both their immense value and the means to disguise their sale. The investigation had shifted from suspicion to pursuit, and the next step would bring them dangerously close to the truth. The jewel trail. Harcourt's discovery of the diamond necklace was the first real crack in the polished facade of royal security. It was no longer just rumour or idle curiosity. Though intentionally obscured in the Parisian auction, the necklace carried traces of its true history. A skilled eye could see the custom clasp designed to fit the former queen's neck, and the arrangement of the stones matched archival photographs taken decades earlier. What troubled Harcourt even more was the method of sale. The auction had been private, invitation only, attended by a handful of elite collectors who had no interest in publicising their acquisitions. That meant whoever was selling the jewels knew exactly how to keep the transactions quiet and the profits clean. The breakthrough reinvigorated the investigation, and Harcourt began widening his search. He tapped discreet contacts in Geneva, Antwerp, and Dubai, cities where high-value gems could change hands without attracting attention. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Several pieces linked to the royal collection had surfaced under vague, almost misleading descriptions in auctions over the past 18 months. A sapphire ring listed merely as European royal origin, a brooch described as mid-19th century, exceptional quality. Even a gold bracelet with an inscription in flowing script, eerily resembling the handwriting of King George VI. Each sale traced back to different auction houses, yet the administrative fingerprints were strikingly similar. The same legal representatives appeared repeatedly. The same luxury couriers were contracted to transport the items, and payments were funneled through a small cluster of offshore accounts. Harcourt knew this level of coordination suggested a single guiding hand behind the operation. When he presented the growing list to Prince William, the room fell into an uneasy silence. William leaned back, staring at the photographs of the jewels laid out before him. Every piece carried not just monetary value, but an irreplaceable link to the monarchy's past. They were more than ornaments. They were chapters of history, worn during coronations, state visits, and family milestones. To see them scattered into the private vaults of collectors felt to him like an act of erasure. The conversation shifted to how these pieces could have left the palace without triggering alarms. Royal jewels were kept under strict watch, with multiple layers of checks for any movement in or out of the vaults. Yet Harcourt explained that someone with the right authority could bypass many safeguards. Temporary removals for cleaning, valuation, or public exhibitions required paperwork. But if that paperwork was signed by someone at the highest level, no one questioned it. That was the unsettling truth. Whoever orchestrated this had both the access and authority to move the jewels without suspicion. The investigation sharpened. Harcourt proposed tracing not just the jewels, but the handlers, couriers, appraisers, and brokers. many of whom knew more than they admitted. In Harcourt's experience, people involved in high-value transactions rarely stayed silent forever, especially if they had been cut out of the profits. It was during a quiet meeting in a dimly lit Antwerp cafe that he found his next lead. An aging gem appraiser, now retired, admitted over coffee that he had once evaluated several pieces with royal characteristics for a private client. 2 years earlier, he had been paid in cash and sworn to confidentiality, yet the memory of the pieces lingered. When Harcourt showed him photographs of the missing jewels, the man immediately pointed to 3. Without hesitation, he recalled them vividly. They had been brought to him by an intermediary, speaking with a refined English accent, claiming to represent a member of the household. Though he could not name the client, he noted that the intermediary always took calls in French. Harcourt tucked the detail away for later. The trail was now warm. The jewels weren't just disappearing. They were being moved with meticulous planning through trusted channels, always cloaked in legitimacy. The question of who stood at the center of this operation was becoming clearer. Soon, Harcourt would find himself staring directly at a connection he had hoped never to see: the hidden middleman. The detail about the refined English accent and casual French usage was enough to narrow his search. Few within the extended royal circle had both the access and the cultural ease to operate across elite European markets. Harcourt began combing discreet contacts who had worked with the monarchy over the past decade, focusing on those involved in art or jewellery transactions. The name that surfaced repeatedly, whispered in hushed tones, was Charles Everley, a former senior aide who had left palace service under vague circumstances. 3 years earlier, Everley had coordinated the movement of royal items for exhibitions and state events, liaising with couriers, appraisers, and security teams, ensuring priceless pieces were handled with utmost care. His departure was officially called an early retirement for personal reasons, but those who knew him quietly speculated that he had fallen out of favour with certain senior figures. Harcourt suspected that Everley's expertise and contacts made him invaluable to anyone seeking to remove jewels discreetly. Tracking Everley was not difficult. He had resurfaced in the luxury market almost immediately after leaving, establishing a small consultancy sourcing rare heritage items for private collectors. His name appeared on the periphery of at least 2 suspicious auctions, not as a direct seller, but as a facilitator, introducing clients to auction houses or private brokers. Harcourt arranged a meeting under the guise of seeking advice for a wealthy client looking to acquire a historically significant tiara. They met in a quiet corner of an exclusive London club, where conversations never left the walls. Everley was as polished as the gems he handled, impeccably dressed, his tone warm yet measured. He spoke freely about rare acquisitions and discreet negotiations, yet Harcourt noticed how carefully he sidestepped any discussion of royal pieces. Only when Harcourt casually mentioned a sapphire ring similar to one in the Queen Mother's collection did Everley's composure shift. Briefly, his smile remained, but his eyes sharpened, calculating. He responded vaguely about how many pieces change hands quietly, without the world ever knowing, before steering the conversation back to neutral territory. By the meeting's end, Harcourt was certain Everley knew far more than he admitted. A deeper background check revealed frequent trips to Geneva and Monaco over the past 18 months, often coinciding with suspicious auction dates. Passenger records also showed he had travelled twice with a woman listed under diplomatic clearance, meaning her identity was hidden from public logs. The threads were beginning to weave together. The middleman was not working alone. He facilitated the movement of royal jewels for someone whose status allowed them to bypass every layer of scrutiny. Harcourt cross-referenced travel dates, auction schedules, and vault access logs. A name surfaced with unsettling clarity, one that brought the investigation dangerously close to the highest ranks of the royal family. The name emerging from Harcourt's research was one he had hoped never to see in black and white. Every document, every record, every coinciding date pointed in the same shocking direction. The woman travelling under diplomatic clearance with Charles Everley was none other than Queen Camilla. The discovery was almost too stark to believe. She had the authority to access the royal vaults without question, a public role to justify wearing or transporting jewels, and the influence to ensure paperwork was signed and sealed without scrutiny. Harcourt knew such an accusation could not be made lightly. The evidence had to be irrefutable before being presented to Prince William. He spent the next 2 weeks verifying every detail. Passenger lists confirmed multiple joint trips to Geneva, Paris, and Monaco. Auction house staff, contacted under the pretense of vetting potential purchases, admitted off the record that a distinguished British woman had personally delivered pieces for valuation. The descriptions, though cautious, left little doubt about her identity. In one instance, a handler recalled the way she removed her gloves with deliberate grace before handing over a velvet box. Inside was a sapphire and diamond brooch, identical to one that had not been seen in the palace collection for nearly 2 years. When Harcourt finally compiled his findings into a leather-bound dossier, he felt the full weight of what he was about to hand over. This was no longer simply a matter of missing jewels. Now it was a breach of trust at the highest level, one that could fracture the monarchy's carefully cultivated image forever. Harcourt requested a private audience with William, away from the usual meeting rooms, choosing instead a quiet study lined with history, books, and old maps, a space steeped in centuries of royal legacy. William listened in silence as Harcourt laid out the evidence piece by piece. The photographs, timelines, and travel logs formed a damning mosaic, each connection precise, leaving almost no room for doubt. When Harcourt finally closed the leather-bound dossier, the air in the room felt heavier, as if the weight of centuries of royal tradition pressed down on both men. For William, the revelation was more than personal betrayal. It was a direct threat to the integrity of the monarchy itself. The jewels were more than property. They were symbols of continuity, tangible links to the past. To see them sold in secret to private collectors was to watch parts of history vanish into oblivion. His first instinct was disbelief, quickly replaced by a cold, steely resolve. If this were true, it could not be ignored. But confronting a member of his own family, one with a public role so visible, risked igniting a storm unlike anything the palace had faced in decades. As the meeting ended, William kept the dossier on the desk, staring at its leather cover with a mix of dread and determination. He understood that opening it again meant committing to a course with no turning back, and in the ensuing quiet, it was clear the decision he was about to make could alter the royal family forever. The confrontation, the act of facing Camilla, was not one to be taken lightly. For days, William carried the dossier with him, reviewing its contents in the early hours and late at night, when the palace was still. Each time he opened it, the evidence remained cold, precise, undeniable. Yet the thought of placing it before her felt like stepping into uncharted waters, a storm waiting to erupt. He knew that once the words were spoken, there would be no rewind. This was not a policy disagreement or a private family quarrel. This was an accusation that could topple reputations and redefine relationships forever. He chose the blue drawing room in Buckingham Palace, a space both formal and private, with heavy drapes that shut out the outside world. Camilla arrived with her usual composure. Smile polite but guarded, she seated herself across from him, folding her hands in her lap, the very picture of royal poise. William began without ceremony, sliding the dossier across the table. He asked her to review it before he said anything. She glanced at the cover but made no move to open it, lifting her eyes to meet his instead. "What is this about?" she asked, tone even but edged with curiosity. William kept his voice steady, explaining the findings: auction records, travel logs, and testimony from those who had handled the jewels. With every detail he shared, Camilla's expression remained still, though there was a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. She did not deny travelling with Charles Everleigh, but she dismissed any connection to the missing jewels as a web of coincidences being stretched into a conspiracy. William pressed further, asking why certain heirlooms had not been seen in years and why their official records contained unexplained gaps. Camilla countered, claiming pieces were often moved quietly for restoration or discreetly lent for diplomatic purposes. It was, she insisted, part of the work. No one outside truly understood. But when William asked for documentation of those loans, she paused, just a fraction too long, before replying. The conversation grew heavier, the air thick with unspoken history and the fragile bond between stepson and stepmother. William's voice remained calm, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. He reminded her of the responsibility they all carried, to safeguard a legacy entrusted to them, a duty far above personal gain or private arrangements. Camilla bristled at the implication, her voice sharpening as she accused him of being swayed by palace gossip and ambitious advisers. The meeting ended without resolution. Camilla rose, smoothing her jacket as she left the room, her posture unbroken, but her silence was telling. William remained seated for several minutes, staring at the closed door, the weight of the encounter pressing down. The confrontation had not produced a confession, but it had confirmed something equally vital. She was aware of the investigation, and now she knew how much he knew. The balance between them had shifted. There would be no return to the quiet civility once maintained. The next steps would have to be decisive, for hesitation could cost the monarchy far more than the jewels themselves. A palace shockwave was inevitable. The tension from the confrontation did not stay contained within the blue drawing room. By the next morning, subtle changes in the palace atmosphere were impossible to ignore. Staff moved with strained politeness. Conversations were cut short when certain figures passed, glances exchanged with an unspoken question hanging in the air. No official word had been given, yet everyone sensed a storm brewing. The palace had its own way of sensing when the ground was shifting. News of a serious dispute between William and Camilla began circulating among the inner circle, carried on whispers and half-heard remarks. Courtiers closest to both found themselves in an uneasy balancing act, knowing better than to ask direct questions, yet unable to entirely mask their awareness. Even those not privy to details noticed sudden absences. Camilla's name quietly disappeared from certain engagements. A charity luncheon she was scheduled to host was abruptly reassigned. Her name vanished from the guest list of a gala she had confirmed only a week prior. Meanwhile, William moved with deliberate composure in public, expressions carefully measured while privately convening with trusted advisors to discuss the implications of Harcourt's findings. The issue at hand was not just the missing jewels, but the fact that a member of the royal family could be accused of such a breach. Any step William took would invite scrutiny across the institution, with potentially devastating fallout. The monarchy relied on the perception of unity. To act openly against Camilla could shatter that image, yet to remain silent risked losing far more: the trust of the nation and the safeguarding of the crown's heritage. The press, ever attuned to subtle changes in royal schedules, began noticing. Questions arose in newsrooms about Camilla's sudden drop in public appearances. Sharp-eyed reporters connected her recent trips abroad to high-value auctions dates. Nothing concrete appeared in print, yet speculation was gathering momentum. Behind the scenes, palace press officers worked to divert attention with other stories, but in the age of digital leaks and anonymous tips, containment was fragile. Inside Buckingham and Kensington, the once comfortable rhythm of royal life was fractured. Even those with no loyalty felt the unease settle into daily routines. Meetings became shorter, conversations more guarded, awareness of a looming breaking point palpable. William knew his decision could no longer be delayed. Harcourt continued monitoring, reporting that at least one more piece of royal jewellery had quietly surfaced in a foreign collection. Each passing day made it clearer that hesitation was no longer an option. The palace held its breath, waiting for the signal of which way the storm would break. And William understood that when it did, nothing within the monarchy would be the same again. The morning William decided to act was grey, the kind of London day where the air felt heavy, almost charged, as if the city itself was bracing for rain. He had spent the night in his study at Kensington Palace, the dossier lying open beside a pot of untouched tea, every page a record of betrayal. Harcourt's latest report confirmed exactly what William had feared. Another heirloom, a diamond and emerald bracelet once worn by the late Queen Mother, had been traced to a private vault in Zurich. The trail led through the same channels as the others. The pattern was now undeniable. The time for private confrontation had passed. Action had to be public, irreversible and final. William's aides gathered in the early hours, expressions taut as a drawn bow. Every word of the statement had to be precise, measured and unassailable. This was no longer merely a family matter. It was a constitutional decision, one that would set a precedent for how the Crown handled internal breaches of trust. Every syllable, every phrase, carried the weight of centuries of expectation. He knew the statement could not directly accuse Camilla of theft without the proper legal framework, yet it could remove her title and responsibilities under the authority vested in the heir apparent for safeguarding royal assets. By mid-morning, the final text had been signed, sealed, and ready for release. The announcement was to be read from the palace press room, a rare step that underscored the gravity of the matter. When William entered, The room fell into an anticipatory hush. Journalists, some speculating for weeks, leaned forward, pens poised, cameras ready. At the lectern, William rested his hands on the prepared text, looking calmly across the sea of faces, every eye on him. His voice carried calm, yet an unmistakable edge that made every word land with precision. He spoke of the Crown's duty to preserve its heritage, the sacred trust between monarchy and public, and the absolute accountability expected of those serving within it. And then, with unwavering authority, he announced that, effective immediately, Camilla would no longer hold the title of Queen Consort. Her patronages and ceremonial duties would be reassigned. Her public role within the royal family would cease. William expressed gratitude for her years of service, but made clear certain standards could never be compromised. The statement was brief, under 5 minutes, yet its effect was seismic. Within moments, the news exploded across major networks. Social media erupted with shock, support, outrage, and relentless speculation. Analysts dissected every phrase, noting the absence of explicit accusations, but the unmistakable implication. This decision stemmed from serious wrongdoing. Inside the palace, the corridors were hushed. Staff avoided each other's eyes, aware that history had shifted in real time. Camilla, informed privately hours earlier, had already departed. Her exit was discreet, her destination unknown. William returned to his study after the press conference, closing the door behind him, alone with the weight of his actions. The decision had been made, the title stripped, and the Crown's message crystal clear. Yet William knew the storm was far from over. What had been spoken publicly was only part of the truth, and the repercussions would echo far beyond palace walls, touching the monarchy's very legacy. In the days following William's announcement, the royal household navigated uncharted territory. The removal of Camilla's title rippled far beyond Britain. Headlines from London to Washington, Paris to Tokyo carried the story. Royal commentators called it the most decisive action by a future monarch in living memory, a public declaration that no one, regardless of position, was above the duty to protect the Crown's legacy. The palace's official statements remained measured, but the unspoken reality was clear to anyone paying attention. Something serious had occurred behind closed doors, serious enough to warrant unprecedented action. Public reactions were deeply divided. Supporters praised William's courage, seeing it as a signal that the younger generation of royals would hold even family members accountable. Critics deemed it extreme, fearing the fracture of an already delicate family dynamic. Speculation over the missing jewels intensified. Journalists chased leads across Europe, probing auction houses, collector circles, and private vaults. Pieces long believed lost were suddenly in the spotlight, while whispers of secret sales linked to high-profile buyers surfaced in the international press. Inside the palace, a quiet recalibration was underway. Official portraits were updated discreetly to reflect title changes, event programs rewritten, seating charts adjusted, ceremonial duties reassigned. Camilla's absence from state functions became a visual reminder. There were invisible lines one could not cross. William maintained public composure, speaking less about family matters but increasingly emphasizing the preservation of national heritage and royal legacy. Behind the scenes, security around the royal vaults tightened dramatically. Access logs were digitized, oversight measures reinforced, and multi-layered approvals implemented to ensure that nothing of value could leave unchecked. Harcourt's work was complete. He returned to his private consultancy, declining all requests for comment, leaving the palace with the knowledge that the investigation had been handled with utmost discretion. Those closest to the case knew the full truth would likely never reach public ears. Some details were too sensitive, some connections too damaging, with the risk of diplomatic fallout too great to expose. But among the small circle who had handled the dossier, there was unanimous understanding. The removal of the title had been necessary and unavoidable. For William, this moment marked a turning point in how he viewed his role. Inheriting the crown was not enough. He had to defend it, even against threats within the family. The scandal was a painful lesson in leadership costs, but it reinforced his resolve. The jewels, the vaults, the traditions, they were living symbols of continuity, and their protection was non-negotiable. As weeks passed, and the media frenzy slowly faded, one truth remained. The monarchy had weathered the storm, yet it had been changed forever. The crown had drawn a line and made it unmistakably clear. Its legacy would be guarded at any cost. The scandal that began with whispers of missing jewels ended with a decision that reshaped the monarchy. William's removal of Camilla's title was more than a disciplinary act. It was a declaration that the crown's integrity outweighed personal ties. The investigation had exposed vulnerabilities, but it had also reinforced a timeless truth. The public rarely saw that safeguarding history sometimes demands painful choices. While the full story would remain locked behind palace doors, the message was unmistakable. The treasures of the monarchy, both symbolic and real, would be protected with unwavering resolve, no matter who stood in the way. If you found this shocking royal saga captivating, don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and comment. Stay tuned for more revelations from inside the palace walls.